Boldwood presents Army Girls, Operation Winter Wedding, written by Fenella J Miller and read by Claire Morgan. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Camberley Barracks, May 1942. Clara Felgate was sad to say goodbye to the chums she'd made at basic training, but eager to get to Camberley Barracks and begin the next step in her ATS career. She was going to train to be a driver in the Auxiliary Territorial Army, the Women's Army, and eventually become a dispatch rider and would then be using a motorbike. She was thrilled to have this opportunity. Waterloo Station was noisy with clanking, hissing engines, guards and porters yelling. Passengers, most of them in uniform, were weaving in and out of the chaos, the servicemen and women carrying heavy canvas kit bags over their shoulders. Clara headed for the platform where her train should be waiting, although nowadays trains were late, as they had to shunt into sidings to allow troop trains past, or wait at signals whilst crucial goods trains took precedence. She was hoping this was the case today, as if her train had left on time, then she'd already have missed it. Someone bumped into her, and the ATS girl called out an apology as she ran past. "Sorry, I'm desperate to catch the Camberley train." Clara increased her pace and followed. "So am I. I'm hoping it's running late." Together they tore past the guard, not even pausing to wave their travel warrants. "In here, ladies, you'll just make it," an RAF chap yelled from the last remaining open door. "I'll hold the door for you." Clara and her fellow runner threw themselves onto the train seconds before the guard waved his flag and blew his whistle. "Shut that bloody door, you lot, why don't you?" the irate man yelled. Clara tumbled through the door on top of her bag, just managing to drag her legs in safely as the helpful pilot slammed it shut behind her. It took her a few moments to recover her breath and untangle her legs from the handles of her kit bag. She pushed herself onto her knees and smiled up at the grinning Brylcreem boy. He had the distinctive gold wings over his breast pocket. She'd noticed them as she'd fallen into the train. "Thanks for that. Much appreciated." "My pleasure. Derek Goody, flying officer, at your service. Cutting it a bit fine, weren't you? We both thought it would leave 20 minutes late. More fool us. I'm Emma Denny. Pleased to meet you, Derek." Clara was now upright. "I'm Clara Felgate. Are you stationed in Surrey?" The handsome, dark-haired young man shook his head. "No, a week's crash leave, so visiting the olds." She wasn't quite sure to whom he was referring as olds, but guessed he meant his parents or possibly his grandparents. "Crash leave? You don't look injured," Emma said as she looked him up and down. "No, all tickety-boo. Pranged the old hurry, though, and in rather bad odour with the skip, you know." Clara smiled and nodded, but was actually unclear what he'd been telling them. Pranged must be an RAF term for crashed, a hurry, a hurricane, and the skip his squadron leader, perhaps. There were no seats on the train, which wasn't unusual, but the strong canvas kit bags when turned on end made excellent seats. The pilot shuffled up a bit and made room for the two of them, and once they were settled, they began chatting. "Are you off to Camberley Barracks, where the driving school is? My mother's always talking about you girls learning to drive and making a darned good job of it. So much so, I might add, that she's now insisting my father let her drive the family car as soon as there's petrol to go in it." "Good for her," Emma said, and slightly turned her back on Clara, leaving her out of the conversation. "I'm certainly going to learn to be a driver, but I don't know about Clara." "I am going on the course, but as I can already drive a car, I'm hoping that learning to drive will be a piece of cake," Clara said. She deliberately used this RAF slang term, as it was one she'd heard a few times. Derek moved his kit bag so they were sitting facing each other, and she was no longer excluded. His little act of kindness pleased her, but it made her a little wary of Emma. Maybe she wasn't going to make a friend of her. "My family live a mile from the barracks. I hope that means I can toddle over and see both of you. They've got an excellent naffy there, and last time I was home I was allowed to use it." Emma spoke first, not allowing Clara to answer. "I was told they have regular dances, shows and so on at the weekends. I hope you can wangle an invite to one of them." "There's already a surplus of men on the base, Emma, so I hardly think a pilot will be welcome," Clara said smoothly. She smiled at Derek. "I expect they have socials in the village hall once a month. I used to love playing the party games and then dancing afterwards." He took her cue. "They certainly do, although they hold them in the afternoon now because of the blackout. Mum said there's one this Saturday. I don't suppose you'll get the time off, but if you do, Clara, I'll see you there." Emma looked peeved that the handsome pilot had invited Clara by name. "Those sorts of occasions are more for old folk and children, not for someone like me." Derek raised his eyebrows, and Clara hid her smile. "Fair enough. Only tea and biscuits served. We have to nip across to the local hostelry for a quick bevy if we want any alcohol." "That suits me. I don't really drink. Mind you, that's not really true, as I do enjoy a glass of wine or champagne. Not that there's any of that about at the moment," Clara said. "Hoity-toity! Gin and it for me, or a nice glass of sweet sherry. I've been known to drink a shandy if nothing else is available," Emma said, but she was laughing as she spoke. "I've never been to a social. I've heard about them, and they don't sound too bad. It's the kiddies I don't like. For some reason I just don't get on with them." Derek grinned. "What about the old folk? Don't you get on with them either?" "No, I mean, yes, I like old people. I grew up with my gran and granddad, and they're the best." Clara thought that Emma might be okay after all. "My family disowned me when I joined the ATS. I doubt I'll ever see them again." She wasn't sure why she'd blurted this information out, as it wasn't something she usually talked about. Derek was easy to chat to. "Crikey, that's rough," Derek said. "I suppose you were sent away to boarding school when you were very young. There are several chaps in my squadron who had upbringings like that. I went to the local grammar school, and thank God I did." Emma was looking at Clara strangely. "My dad was gassed in the First War, never really recovered and died when I was a nipper. My mum remarried and I wasn't wanted. I was lucky. I was better off where I was," Emma said. They continued to chat about the war, the blackout and other less personal topics, and by the time the train steamed into Camberley Station, they were getting on well. The most important piece of information Clara had gleaned from the pilot was that the barracks were only a mile away. Emma was actually quite funny, Derek was rather charming, and Clara rather thought the two of them might be interested in each other, despite the somewhat tricky start to their acquaintance. The journey was short. Camberley was only an hour away from London, and the train had clanked into the station still on time. The platform was crowded, but Clara, being tall for a girl, was able to see over a lot of the heads. "There are lots of other ATS girls carrying their full kit. I assume that means there'll be transport for us." "I'll say toodle pip, ladies, and hope to see you both at the social if you can get the evening free," Derek said. Then, with a casual flip of his hand, he strode off swinging his leather suitcase in one hand, leaving them to find their own way. Emma wasn't impressed. "Well, that was rather rude, don't you think? I thought we were getting on famously, but was obviously wrong, otherwise he'd not have sauntered off like that." "He was friendly, but not my type. I thought that you two might have a connection, though. Emma hefted her kit bag onto her shoulder. I did like him, but impossible to make a real attachment if you're in different services. As they'd got on the train at the last minute, they had the furthest to walk to the exit. We'd better get a move on. We don't want to be left behind, Clara said, and increased her pace. They emerged into the forecourt to find a milling crowd of ATS, but no transport waiting. Clara appeared to be the only NCO amongst the girls and decided to restore some sort of order. Right, ladies, we're ATS, not housewives at a jumble sale. In a column, 2 abreast, if you please. She'd pitched her voice loud enough for them all to hear, and they were so used to following orders that they did what she asked without argument. Once they were lined up to her satisfaction, she told them what she had in mind. We'll wait for 15 minutes, and if no transport has arrived by then, we'll march to the barracks. We need to be out of the way, so we'll assemble over there. Clara gestured towards a convenient hip-height brick wall, which would be perfect for perching on. Emma had paired up with a jolly woman who was old enough to be any of their mothers. She must be 40 at least, but that didn't mean she couldn't be a perfectly competent driver. Clara propped her bag against the wall and then walked up and down the line of girls, introducing herself. Was 15 minutes long enough to wait? Trains often ran late, so the transport might well have factored that information into their arrival. We'll give it another 10 minutes, ladies. There's a public WC over there, so if anyone needs to use the facilities, now would be a good time. A handful of khaki-uniformed girls took her advice and rushed across the forecourt. Clara got the rest organised so they were standing side by side. They couldn't march in threes as they would take up too much room on the pavement or the road. She glanced at her wristwatch. They'd been waiting 25 minutes. Long enough. Those that had used the loo were now back and ready to march. They were just exiting the station forecourt when a dilapidated 3-ton lorry turned in. The driver, a grumpy-looking male private, scowled out of his window. What the bleeding hell do you think you lot are doing? I ain't driven here in my lunch break just to find you lot are buggered off. Clara strode up to the lorry. Watch your language, Private. You don't speak to an NCO like that. You're late. I'll be writing you up for your insolence and tardiness. The man opened and shut his mouth like a goldfish. She held her breath, waiting for his angry retort. Right, Lance Corporal. Begging your pardon. If you care to up in the back, I'll take you to the barracks. The lazy sod should have got out and opened it for us. That's what drivers do. Maud, the older lady, said sharply. It'll be quicker to do it ourselves. It'll go on his charge sheet, don't worry, Clara replied. There was no need for her to issue orders, as 2 of the girls had already unhooked the tailgate, rattled back the canvas that covered the entrance, and without waiting for her permission, threw their bags in and jumped up after them. 5 minutes after the lorry had arrived, the bags were safely in the centre space, and the girls were sitting on either side of the slippery wooden benches. Clara had chosen to sit by the exit and called to the girls sitting closest to the front of the vehicle. Reach through the canvas and bang on the cab. Let him know we're ready to leave. The lorry lurched off. Brace your feet against the bags, girls. I think he's likely to try and dislodge us at every opportunity. He obviously doesn't like the ATS. Her prediction was correct, but nobody ended up in a tangle of arms and legs and kit bags in the centre of the vehicle. It was only a little over a mile from the station, so they should have arrived in less than 15 minutes. It was over half an hour, and they were still travelling. Clara picked her way through the bags, pushed aside the canvas at the rear of the lorry, and then stretched over to thump forcefully on the cracked glass that separated them from the driver. Her fist hit the partition directly behind the driver's head. Her signal to stop was ignored, although she knew he'd heard her. Unless she'd been misinformed and they weren't actually going to the driving school at Camberley, their driver was taking them on a very circuitous route. The girl whose feet she'd just stepped on tugged at the back of her uniform jacket.
"Here, what's going on? We should have been there ages ago."
"I know. That's why I'm trying to get the wretched man to stop. I know he heard me banging." Clara looked round to see to whom she was speaking. The private introduced herself as Gladys, a tough-looking girl from the East End of London.
"Give over. I'll stop the bugger."
Not waiting for permission to do so, Gladys produced what looked suspiciously like something a burglar would carry in order to break into a house. Assisted by her friend, she leaned across the gap and put the end of the metal tool into the edge of the glass and levered it out. Clara was impressed and concerned in equal measures by Gladys and her friend. She nodded her thanks and took a firm grip on the shuddering chassis.
"You will halt this vehicle now, driver. That's an order,"
she yelled into his ear. If Gladys hadn't been hanging onto the back of her jacket, Clara would have ended up in the cab on top of him. He slammed on the brakes, throwing everybody from the benches. The rear of the vehicle was in chaos.
"Is anybody hurt? If you think you've broken a limb, remain where you are. Everyone else carefully get back on the benches."
It took several minutes to sort things out, but fortunately, nobody had been seriously hurt. The driver should have come around to the rear of the vehicle to check for himself, to investigate why he'd been told to do an emergency stop. He hadn't done so. The girl sitting at the other end already had the pins out of the tailgate, and it was dangling down. Clara scrambled over the kit bags and dropped to the ground. If she hadn't been leaning against the lorry, she thought she might have slid to the floor. Where on earth were they? They certainly weren't where they were supposed to be. There were fields and trees in every direction, and absolutely no sign of Camberley Barracks. She was joined on the ground by the first of the girls.
"Bleeding hell, I ain't seen nothing like this before. Where are all the bleeding houses?"
Gladys said in disgust. "I've no idea. I'm going to talk to the driver to see what on earth he's playing at." Emma appeared beside her. "I just had a look, Clara. Silly sod has knocked himself out on the steering wheel, so you can't ask him." By the time Clara had organised a stretcher party and moved the unconscious driver with a nasty-looking lump on his forehead to the rear of the lorry, she had some idea where they were, but not why they were there. One of the girls had clambered on top of the cab and had been able to see what looked like the barracks a few miles away across the fields.
"Right, everybody back inside. I've never driven a lorry, but I've driven a tractor and a car, so I'm pretty sure driving this won't be too complicated. Emma, I need you to navigate. If you hang out of the window, you should be able to keep directing me towards the barracks." Nobody argued, and showing more confidence than she actually felt, Clara took her place behind the steering wheel. They left the canvas at the rear of the vehicle open, so the girl sitting there could also help with the navigation. Her finger was shaking as she pressed the button that started the engine. It spluttered into life immediately. She stalled twice before getting the hang of the clutch, but once they were moving, it was easier. An hour after taking the driver's place, she pulled up beside the guards at the gate to the barracks. Clara had already rehearsed how she was going to explain why she was driving, but, to her astonishment, the guard just nodded and waved them through. She almost refused, as she'd no idea where she was supposed to be going, but thought it would be easier to explain what had happened when they were safely inside the perimeter. "That looks like that could be the admin building, Clara," Emma said, pointing to a substantial brick-built building 100 yards ahead. There were dozens of male soldiers marching about, but their arrival was being ignored. Where are the ATS? I've a horrible feeling we've come in the wrong gate, Clara said. Crikey, I think you're right. Shall I ask one of the NCSs over there? Emma suggested. Clara edged the lorry forward and Emma leaned out of the window. Excuse me, Corp, we need the medical centre and also directions to the ATS admin building. The soldier nodded. Turn left just ahead and the hospital is on your right. Then turn left at the end of the road and keep going. Your lot are down there somewhere. We aren't allowed anywhere near. The man grinned. You come in the main gates. ATS vehicles have their own gate at the rear of the barracks. Thanks, Corp. We weren't stopped at the gate, so came in. We have ATS drivers working here because of the driving school. Clara nodded her thanks and drove smoothly to the small hospital. Emma had the door open before they were quite stationary. I'll fetch the medics, she said as she jumped down. The semi-conscious driver was rushed inside, and as soon as Emma was safely beside her, Clara drove away. She'd make her report to her own officers. She wanted to deliver the girls immediately. They must be horribly late. With some trepidation, Clara followed the corporal's instructions, and on turning into the ATS section, she immediately saw the only brick-built buildings. This would be where the officers would be found. Now to face the music. Chapter 2. Clara drove the lorry across the swept gravel square and down a narrow lane on the far side. From her vantage point, she'd seen the tops of other vehicles, as well as a large open-fronted building that she thought was probably where they learnt how to maintain an engine. I want to march the girls in a column when we report at the admin building, she told Emma, who was looking somewhat surprised they hadn't stopped. Makes sense to appear in an orderly fashion. She was craning out of the window and sat back with a sigh. I think I've just seen where we're going to be billeted. There's a huddle of huts and what's obviously the latrines and ablutions just behind the admin block. I'm sure it won't be any worse than places we've already lived in. At least we won't have to deal with scorpions in our shoes. Emma laughed. My brother's in Egypt, and he's told us all about having to check their boots every morning. A sergeant was gawping at the lorry, as Clara, with more luck than judgment, parked it neatly in front of him. I'll go and speak to him. Would you get the girls out whilst I'm doing so? Good luck with that. He looks a miserable old bloke and not impressed by your driving either. Clara made sure the handbrake was on, the lorry in first gear, and then jumped nimbly to the ground. Sergeant, Lance Corporal Felgate reporting with... He waved a hand, indicating that she was to stop talking. And then, shaking his head, he actually walked over and peered into the cab, as if expecting to find the missing male driver there. Whilst he was recovering from the shock of having his precious lorry arrive driven by an untrained female, Clara was pleased to see the girls were tumbling out of the back of the lorry and shuffling into a neat column. Where's the driver? I was about to explain, Sergeant, that the driver knocked himself out on the steering wheel in the middle of nowhere, and as I can already drive a car and a tractor, it made sense for me to take over. The sergeant shook his head, puffed out his cheeks, and then roared with laughter. Well, bugger me! This is a turn-up for the books. Seems like you don't need any training, Lance Corporal Felgate, if you manage to get this old girl back here in one piece. He pointed to the path, neatly lined by white-painted stones, that led between two of the brick-built administrative buildings. Take your girls through there, Felgate. I warn you, there'll be a reception committee. I'm not sure if you'll be congratulated or put on a charge. Clara could hear him chuckling to himself as he wandered back into the garage and yelled for someone to park the lorry in the correct place. OK, ladies, none of this was your fault. Heads high, shoulders back, let's show them we're the best intake they've ever had. Whatever the outcome of this adventure, it had welded this group of disparate women into a solid team. She marched at the head of the column and didn't need to glance over her shoulder to know they were following her lead perfectly. One thing every trainee had to master fast was the ability to drill, to march correctly, and to follow orders. It was just good luck that this group was an uneven number, so her being in front didn't leave one girl marching alone. She halted them directly outside the entrance to the block. "At ease, girls. I'll let them know we're here." Clara marched into the building and was met by an unsmiling officer, a senior commander. She saluted smartly. "Lance Corporal Felgate, ma'am, and 14 privates reporting for driver training." "Not only are you 2 hours late, your driver brought you through the wrong entrance. Exactly what is going on?" "I beg your pardon, ma'am, but would it be possible for somebody to take the girls to their billets so they can get settled? I will remain here, of course, and give you a full report." Something flickered in the woman's expression, and she looked slightly less formidable. She must be able to see the girls lined up outside and know that it was hours since they'd eaten, or more importantly, had access to a WC. "Yes, Felgate, that makes sense." The senior commander sent a corporal out to take care of this, and then pointed to the open door of what was presumably her office. "There's a WC just behind you. Join me when you're ready." With considerable relief, Clara used the facilities, washed her face and hands and straightened her cap. Then she checked her stocking seams were straight and her shoes still highly polished. Satisfied she looked as she should, she marched into the office. "Excellent, Felgate. Sit down and tell me exactly what happened." Halfway through her explanation of this extraordinary set of circumstances, an orderly came in carrying a tray with a very welcome pot of tea, sandwiches, and cakes. To her surprise, the senior commander poured out the tea, piled a plate with food, and placed it in front of Clara. "Whilst you help yourself, my dear, I'm going to inquire how the driver's doing." After a few minutes on the telephone, she smiled and replaced the receiver. "He has a slight concussion, nothing worse, thank goodness. However, once he's recovered from that, he's going to be in for a rather unpleasant few weeks after his disgraceful behaviour." The remainder of the interview was informal. Clara left the office relieved she wasn't going to be put on a charge, and went in search of her cohort. The accommodation for them was a wooden hut, but to her dismay, when she arrived, Clara discovered there was no spare bed for her. The building was large enough for an extra one to be brought in. There was a big table with chairs around it at one end, a cast-iron pot-bellied stove in the centre, and the beds were arranged head to toe alternately down each side. There was a small locker positioned at the head end of each, which didn't have a lot of room to get in and out. There was also a row of metal wardrobes against the walls. She frowned. Perhaps another bed in here just wouldn't work. "We're lucky. This building has only just been fitted out. The girls just finishing their course are billeted off camp," Emma told her. "Not sure why we're a bed short." "Never mind. I'll find one somewhere. They knew how many of us were coming, so there must be one for me in another hut," Clara told them. "It ain't right. You should be in with us," Gladys said, and the others echoed her disapproval. It was Emma who came up with an explanation, one Clara should have thought of for herself. "You're a junior NCO. I reckon you sleep with them, not in here with us." "That could be the explanation. Everything in here is tickety-boo, so go in search of your tea. I take it you were told where the mess is?" "It's the long wooden building opposite the admin block. There's a nice rec room too, even got ping-pong," Emma said happily. "Where are the lecture rooms?" Clara asked. "Buggered if I know," Gladys said. "They never told us that. I expect we'll find out soon enough.
Clara followed them, but continued to the main block, leaving them to join the other platoon of ATS learner drivers just completing their course. It was a grueling 12 weeks, and she was aware that a substantial proportion of the candidates were likely to fail and be returned to basic training or to be posted somewhere else. She was hailed by a willowy, fair-haired corporal as she approached the building.
Good show. I was just coming to see you. Senior Commander Reynolds has promoted you to corporal with immediate effect. I'm to take you to the stores to collect your stripes, and then you're going to share with me. Not much, but better than the horrible hut your girls have to live in. She smiled. I'm permanently based here in the stores.
Clara barely took in what she'd been told.
Golly, I didn't expect stripes. I'm Clara, by the way. I suppose you've heard about what happened to us.
I did. It's the talk of the barracks. That driver you had shouldn't have been on duty. He's a bit unstable and was about to be invalided out.
I did think his behaviour was peculiar. I suppose we'll never know what he intended to do with us out in the countryside.
If you hadn't known how to drive, you'd probably still be out there waiting to be found.
I'm Ellen. Pleased to meet you, she grinned.
I'm not surprised you got an extra stripe. I think you deserve a medal. Ellen led Clara through the maze of paths and across the main barrack square to the huge building that housed the general stores. She handed over the slip of paper Ellen had given her and was given a small packet in return. She had her sewing kit, her hussif, and would attach the stripes as soon as she could. I expect they want to send you off to Octu when you leave here, Ellen said.
I don't want to be an officer. I want to be a dispatch rider and go abroad with the invasion force.
If you want to go abroad, then you should ask to drive an ambulance. The Fanny lot are the ones who drive them.
Aren't they now part of the ATS?
Clara asked. They are, but a lot of them still think they're a cut above us. Do you speak French?
I do. I'm not fluent, but I can get by. Why?
They'll snap you up when they know that. Why don't you learn to drive an ambulance, do the St. John's course, and then do the dispatch rider training?
I'll think about it.
This was definitely something she would investigate. Ellen stopped in front of a small huddle of huts, little more than sheds, really. This is where the NCOs are billeted. Officers are in the main block. She pushed open the door of the one she was standing in front of. Home sweet home! Clara stepped in. There were 2 iron bedsteads, but both with real mattresses, and unlike the beds the privates used, they were made up ready to sleep in. There were a dozen hooks on the wall, half already in use, a shared chest of drawers, and that was it. There was just enough room to open and close the door.
Someone's already brought my kit bag over for me, she pointed out, touched at this gesture from one of her troop.
I've got the top 2 drawers, the bottom 2 are yours. The unused hooks are yours as well, Ellen said. I'm going to run. I might just be in time for tea if I hurry. Clara was just hanging her greatcoat up when there was a knock on the door.
Come in,
she called. The door flew open and Emma burst in. Blimey, this is a bit pokey. We've got more room in our hut. She waved a similar packet to the one Clara had just collected. Thanks to you getting me to help, I've been made up to Lance Corp. Clara beamed and stepped forward to hug her new friend.
You deserve it. Isn't this fun? If we'd marched to the base, we'd have missed all the excitement and neither of us would have been promoted.
The next day, Clara escorted her group to the stores before they went to the mess for breakfast, where they were given the necessary items needed to become a driver. She was now the proud owner of battle-dress trousers, shirt, and battle-dress blouse. On top of that, she had a sweater, scarf, and a balaclava helmet. These extras augmented the kit she already had. She was keen to join her charges for breakfast suitably dressed. She'd already spent an hour with the sergeant, being told what her duties would be, and realised she was going to be spending most of her free time learning everything involved with being an NCO. Usually, a private was sent off to do a course, a CARDA, before being given their stripes. She greeted each girl by name as she walked past them, and only got it wrong once.
Everyone looks well rested and immaculately turned out. It's not my job to check your billet every day, but I'm sure I'd find it as it should be.
Gladys tugged at her sleeve as she walked past.
Are we in competition with the other lot, Corp? I like a bit of competition.
Not directly. It's not like in basic training. However, I'm sure they'll be as keen as us to be the best group here. Clara moved on, chatting and smiling, and was satisfied nobody was unhappy and all seemed to have settled in well. The ATS obviously had their own facilities, and there must be around 50 of them. 30 or so trainees, and at least 20 general duties girls no doubt permanently based at Camberley. Probably clerks, orderlies and cooks. She finished her porridge and a slice of toast before standing up and waving the list she'd been given by the sergeant at the girls around the table.
I've got this week's itinerary. Do you want me to read it out, or shall I just hand it round?
Clara called down the noisy table. The consensus was to pass it round so they could read it themselves whilst they ate. Emma was sitting next to her at the end of the table.
After you've all seen it, I'm going to pin it up in the rec room. We've got an introductory lecture which explains what we're going to be doing, and then straight to the garage.
Emma read it first, and then passed it on. Clara needed some information from her.
I've got to divide the girls into groups of 3. I'm hoping you can at least give me an idea of whom not to put together, as you know them better than I do.
Not alphabetically. That makes a change. There are a couple of girls who don't get on, so better to keep them apart. Clara made a note of their names in the little black notebook she'd been given. Which group are you going to put yourself in?
Actually, after the lecture, I've got a preliminary driving test. If I can pass that, then I don't have to do the basic training.
Instead of being annoyed, Emma nodded. That makes perfect sense. No point in you doing something you already know. What will you do instead?
I have to prove proficient at driving all the vehicles here. I know I'll be fine with any car or van, but I do need a lot more practice with the lorry. I doubt very much I could reverse that safely at the moment.
An orderly came round with a large enamelled teapot and topped their mugs up.
We've got PT once a week, no regular drill, and a remarkable amount of free time. There's the usual one night a week doing repairs and renovations to our kit, and bath night, but apart from that we have the evenings off to study,
Clara said. I noticed there's a dance at the NAFI on Friday night, church parade on Sunday morning, but it appears we can leave the base on Saturday if we want, Emma said, a little embarrassed. You seemed keen to go on the social. Can I come with you?
I expect most of the girls will go. I'm not sure that I will. I've got a lot of pamphlets and so on to read and digest. I've been promoted suddenly, so I've got to learn it all in my spare time.
You will come to the dance, though? Clara shrugged. She didn't want to seem standoffish, and was well aware that if she wanted to fit in, she needed to at least join in some of the recreational activities. She did like to dance, but this would be an event for other ranks only, and she'd a good idea how some of the men would behave.
Probably not this one, but I'll certainly come to the next. I won't be content until I'm sure I know everything I should. There are things you need to know about your new position, too. I'd be happy to talk you through them. In fact, I think it's probably my job to do so.
I tell you what, when you're up to speed, you can fill me in. Not everybody's like you, Clara. Some of us want to have a bit of fun in our lives. Maybe Emma's promotion was premature, as she didn't seem to have the right attitude for somebody with extra responsibilities. It was too soon to make such a judgment, Clara thought, and decided she would be better off sorting the lists rather than finding fault with Emma. Possibly Emma was right. Life shouldn't be all work, even if there was a war on. "Excuse me, Emma, but I need to get these lists done, as I've got to put everyone in their groups at the end of the lecture. Thank you for the heads up about the two that don't get on." Clara collected her irons and rinsed them in the bucket of tepid water by the door, and then hurried to the ablutions block where she could give them a proper wash and dry them. Officers didn't have to carry their own cutlery and mug around with them, and had an orderly to take care of their quarters and sort out their laundry, but this didn't appeal to her. She was determined to get herself attached to an infantry brigade and go abroad with them when the time came to take Europe back from the Nazis. Hopefully as a dispatch rider, but if not, as an ambulance driver, if that was what it would take. This had been her intention ever since she'd joined up. It was why she hadn't gone for a higher status technical trade like her friends, but had opted for driving. The lecture was more an information session, making sure that all the girls knew what was expected of them, how much free time they had, and what recreational facilities there were on the base and in Camberley itself. The other squad didn't have their own NCOs, so an ATS sergeant was looking after them. Clara told her squad which group they were in, and that they now had to report to the garage. "At the moment, there aren't enough instructors, which is why you're in groups of 3. You'll have to take it in turns to learn to drive. In the morning, you'll go out in the car, and in the afternoon, you're in the workshop." "What about the PT and lectures?" Gladys asked. "That starts next week. This week is about getting to grips, literally, with driving and what's under the bonnet." Emma pointed out what no doubt the others were thinking. "When do you get to learn mechanics, Corp? You have to be able to fix your vehicle as well as drive it." "I'm only involved with the tests today, and then I'll be spending all my time learning how things work." Once a driver was trained and posted, she'd be expected to service the vehicle she drove, and this was an aspect of the job that Clara was eager to learn. Chapter 3. Clara left the lecture and went in search of the driving instructor who was going to assess her abilities. This was more complicated than she'd expected, as none of those she asked knew anything about this arrangement. Eventually, she got into conversation with a junior subaltern, the ATS equivalent of a first lieutenant, who seemed only too happy to talk. "I'm afraid I can't help you find the instructor, Corporal, but I'd be happy to give you a tour of the camp and help you look. Do you know if it's an ATS or regular army person that you're looking for?" "I've no idea, Mom, but I'll be happy to explore this huge camp. I don't want my girls getting lost and getting into difficulties with inebriated soldiers." The officer smiled and nodded, and didn't deny this could happen, which was a concern. "Although there are probably 100 or more ATS working here, most of them are billeted off base for that very reason. Only one squad of girls being trained as drivers are billeted here, and the other squad are living in a private house." "Good heavens! I'm surprised that as they were here first, they aren't the ones living in the hut. Mind you, it's quite possible their billet is a lot more luxurious than what's available here." The young officer, who still remained anonymous as she'd not volunteered her name, pulled a face. "Regrettably, the girls billeted off camp are obliged to walk across the golf course in order to get here, and they have no hot water and no heating. That doesn't matter at the moment, but I imagine it's really unpleasant in the winter." Clara smiled at the thought of those poor girls falling headfirst into bunkers and walking in their heavy shoes across the greens. They certainly wouldn't be popular with those who could still afford to play golf. "I wonder why the golf course hasn't been ploughed up like other green areas," she said to the officer. "It takes years to get the links fit to play on, so I expect someone wealthy and important has insisted that the links be left intact.
I don't know about you, Corporal, but I hope the girls are making it impossible for them to play a satisfactory round.
This comment surprised Clara, as in her limited experience, officers didn't express opinions of a political nature, but she wholeheartedly agreed with this sentiment. She really wanted to know this officer's name.
I'm Clara Felgate, and I agree with you.
Actually, I know who you were. Word has travelled about your rather unusual arrival yesterday, and of your immediate promotion. I'm Sylvia Prescott. They nodded and smiled at each other. If all officers were like Sylvia, then Clara might reconsider her decision not to join their ranks. They marched around the enormous camp, not in the areas where the soldiers resided, but at the end of this tour, Clara knew where the cinema was and the gym and other places she and her troop would have to visit. They finished the long walk in the excellent naffy. I've got to leave you here, Corporal. It wouldn't do for us to be seen socialising. Clara promptly saluted, and the action was returned. Then she was left to either find her way back to the workshop or treat herself to a much-needed mug of tea. Unfortunately, she hadn't brought her irons with her. She smiled at her error. Here, everything was supplied. It was only in their own mess that they had to provide cutlery and mugs. She looked longingly at the counter, and then, with a sigh, hurried out and returned to the garage. A tall officer, a captain, she thought from his epaulettes, was waiting for her, and he wasn't happy, but looked livid. "Where the hell have you been all morning, Corporal?" She saluted, but he ignored this and continued to glare down at her. He was quite old, probably almost 30, had dark hair, regular features, and the most terrifying slate-grey eyes that were boring into her.
I apologise if I've kept you waiting, sir.
He didn't allow her to finish. Waiting? I've been stuck here for the best part of an hour. I didn't want this job. I have better things to do than drive around the countryside with a female. If he'd been a horse, steam would have been puffing out of his nostrils. She was about to attempt to explain where she'd been, but again, he didn't give her the chance. It might have escaped your notice, Felgate, but there's a war on. He pointed not to an Austin, but to what was obviously his own vehicle. A dark blue open-topped sports car. Get in, and if you so much as scratch my car, I'll be very unhappy. Clara should have meekly trotted across to the expensive, highly unsuitable car and shown him just how good a driver she was. But instead, she looked up at him.
Then I've nothing to worry about, sir, as that will be an improvement on your present state of mind.
She didn't wait for his reply, but ran across to the car, jumped over the driver's door, and dropped into the seat. She had the engine purring sweetly by the time he arrived in similar fashion in the adjacent seat. She didn't dare look at him, but released the clutch and moved off smoothly but rather faster than was wise. There was a sharp intake of breath from beside her, and Clara laughed. She was already in so much trouble that whatever happened on the drive wouldn't matter. Her cap flew off as the powerful car roared down the narrow lane that ran along the rear of the camp. She was in her element. Her uncle had owned exactly the same Alfa Romeo, and she'd driven it many times. She wasn't reckless, so slowed the car and turned onto the large road at a sensible speed. After 10 minutes, she indicated and pulled onto a clearing at the side of the road. She braced herself, waiting for the bad-tempered officer to let rip. He remained ominously silent. After a few seconds, she risked a sideways glance at him. Her mouth rounded. He was smiling. "You've driven one of these before." It was a statement, not a question. Nervously, she touched her head as if it might somehow miraculously reappear. "Turn round here, Corporal, and take us back.
I know exactly where your missing hat is located. He laughed. You've passed your test. She smiled, delighted that she hadn't upset this fierce officer by what he might have considered her reckless driving. The car had excellent lock, and she completed the maneuver expertly. Then, bubbling with excitement, she took them back to the camp. She'd expected to be failed, deserved to be put on a charge for insubordination, but for some reason, the captain had found her antics amusing. As she was slowing down to turn into the driving school, he suddenly shouted, "Stop!" Thinking this was a test of her emergency stopping ability, she slammed on the brakes. If he hadn't reacted instantly and braced his arms on the dashboard, he would have been thrown forward. What the dickens are you playing at? I almost pitched over the windscreen." Now he was certainly not amused, and was back to being the terrified officer she'd met earlier. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and for a second her tongue seemed to be stuck to the roof of the mouth, and she couldn't answer. "I thought you wanted me to do an emergency stop, sir. I am sorry." "Fair enough. My fault. I was just telling you your missing headgear is in the hedge just there." She was about to jump out and get it, but he forestalled her. "No, stay where you are. I'll get it. Take the car in and park it where you found it." Surprised but pleased, Clara did as he ordered. Her heart was still thumping and her hands were clammy.